Picture thousands of charging janissaries, cannon fire shattering the ancient walls of Constantinople, and Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, draped in silk and gold, sitting atop an infinite pile of plunder. You are taught to view the Ottoman Empire through brilliant military tactics and unstoppable siege engines. What nobody told you is that the real story of Ottoman expansion was not written in blood on the battlefield. It was written in black ink on sheepskin ledgers, filed away in dusty back rooms by an army of obsessive bureaucrats. Because while war wins land, it is cold, ruthless cash flow that keeps an empire from collapsing under its own weight. To understand what it took to run this expansion machine at its peak in the mid-16th century, look at the imperial central ledger for a single military campaign season. Adjusted to modern money, funding a 6-month march into the Balkans cost the Ottoman treasury upwards of $420 million. Not for a decade-long war, for 6 months of movement. That is more than the entire annual operating budget of a major modern metropolis, spent entirely on horse feed, flour, and silver coins paid directly into the palms of infantrymen before the summer heat turned to autumn. If the Sultan's revenue engine misfired by even a fraction of a percent, hundreds of thousands of armed men would not just lose a battle, they would starve, mutiny, and turn their weapons straight toward Istanbul. How do you finance an expansion machine that stretches across 3 continents, controls tens of millions of subjects, and keeps thousands of elite soldiers loyal, centuries before modern central banks, fiat paper currency, or international debt markets? You build the most meticulous administrative extraction engine the medieval world had ever seen. By capturing Constantinople in 1453 and sweeping through Egypt and the Levant by 1517, the Ottoman Empire seized control over the primary trade veins of the known world. Every grain of pepper, every yard of Persian silk, and every bale of Indian cotton heading to Western Europe had to pass through Ottoman customs offices. They sat at the literal crossroads of global commerce, taking a cut of every transaction moving between East and West. Yet their underlying economic model was not Western mercantilism. The Ottomans were not obsessed with hoarding silver and gold for its own sake. Their guiding philosophy was provisionism. The primary goal of the state was simple: keep the central cities, especially Istanbul, completely flooded with food, raw materials, and taxable goods. High supply meant low prices. Low prices meant full bellies. Full bellies meant political stability. To pull this off, the empire relied on pragmatic bookkeeping. They did not force wholesale religious conversion on conquered lands, nor did they dismantle local economies. Instead, they cataloged everything. Imperial scribes swept into newly conquered territories, recording every single village, olive tree, goat, and watermill across millions of square miles into master ledgers called the Tahrir Defterleri. If it produced value, the state knew about it, priced it, and taxed it. But baked into this administrative machine was a structural vulnerability. The entire economy was designed around constant expansion. The state required a steady influx of new land to expand its tax base and reward its military elites. The moment territorial growth stalled, the internal economic machinery would begin to consume itself. Consider how the empire fielded an army of over 50,000 heavy cavalrymen without spending a single silver coin out of the central treasury. This was the Timar system. Instead of collecting taxes in remote provinces, dragging the physical coins back to Istanbul, and distributing salaries, the Sultan assigned local revenue collection rights directly to a cavalryman known as a sipahi. A standard Timar granted the soldier the legal right to collect taxes from a cluster of local villages, worth roughly 20,000 akçe annually, about $45,000 in modern purchasing power. In exchange, the sipahi was bound to that land. He acted as the local law enforcement officer, oversaw agricultural production, collected his pay directly in grain, livestock, and coin, and reported for imperial campaigns on a moment's notice, fully armored and leading his own self-funded squad of secondary mounted fighters. It was an efficient decentralization of military cost. The state avoided massive cash flow bottlenecks and transformed its officer corps into local agricultural managers. But the math was unforgiving. If a sipahi failed to report to campaign, or if bad weather destroyed the harvest, his income vanished, and the cavalry force shrank. Western observers often confuse this with European feudalism, but the two systems were fundamentally different. In Europe, a feudal lord owned his land outright, bound peasants as hereditary serfs, and passed his estate to his children. This created independent regional power bases that constantly challenged royal authority. In the Ottoman Empire, private land ownership was virtually non-existent. Every square inch of arable land belonged legally to the sultan. A sipahi owned nothing. He was merely a state employee on a revocable performance contract. If he underperformed, mismanaged his territory, or abused his peasants, the central government reassigned his land overnight. The Ottomans did not build an entrenched landed aristocracy, they built a corporate military hierarchy using state real estate as variable performance pay. Yet while heavy cavalry could be maintained through agricultural land grants, the empire's lethal edge, the Janissaries, demanded cold, hard cash. The Janissaries were the first standing, professional infantry force in Europe since the fall of the Roman legions. Recruited through the devshirme, a systematic human tax levied on Christian villages in the Balkans, these young men were converted, educated by the state, and trained to serve as elite gunpowder infantry. They were forbidden from owning property or marrying while on active duty. Their sole identity was tied to the regiment, and their absolute loyalty belonged to the Sultan. Maintaining them was an extraordinary financial burden. By the middle of the 16th century, the Ottoman state maintained roughly 12,000 active Janissaries. Each soldier earned a daily wage paid directly from the imperial treasury in high-purity silver coins. Add the continuous expense of uniforms, standardized matchlock muskets, gunpowder, and rations, and this standing force drained over 150 million akçe per year from the central accounts, more than $110 million annually just for infantry payroll. The financial pressure spiked during imperial successions. By long-standing custom, every new sultan was required to pay a massive accession bonus, the kulus bahshishi, to every active janissary upon taking the throne. When Sultan Selim II ascended in 1566, the total accession payout exceeded 700,000 gold ducats, or roughly $130 million in modern value. It was effectively an institutionalized extortion tax paid by the monarch to his own bodyguard to guarantee their loyalty on day one. If payroll was a heavy strain, the sheer logistics of moving an imperial campaign into the field was overwhelming. An Ottoman campaign march was not simply an army on the move, it was a mobile, self-sustaining city of 100,000 men and 60,000 draft animals. To move this massive force across thousands of miles without starving the countryside, an outcome that would spark widespread peasant revolts, the state constructed the Menzil system. This was a network of fortified supply depots spaced 15 to 20 miles apart along primary imperial highways. During the 1529 campaign against Vienna, the logistical ledgers record the consumption of over 30,000 tons of grain, thousands of barrels of salted meat, and hundreds of thousands of gallons of olive oil. The state purchased these supplies months in advance using fixed-price ceilings enforced by imperial market inspectors. To move these mountain-sized stockpiles across roadless terrain, the treasury rented over 90,000 camels from nomadic tribes. Renting a single-pack camel for the duration of a summer campaign cost roughly 150 akçe. Across the entire transport fleet, logistics alone devoured tens of millions of dollars before a single cannon was fired. While contemporary European rulers viewed the Ottoman Empire as a financial juggernaut of limitless wealth, its greatest economic policy contained a hidden, fatal vulnerability. To preserve political order, the state prioritized price stability over profit. Imperial market officials set strict price caps on every essential commodity, from raw wheat to leather boots. While this policy protected urban consumers from price gouging, it intentionally strangled private capital accumulation. European merchants were beginning to form joint stock companies, establish private merchant banks, and reinvest profits into technological innovations. Ottoman merchants, legally barred from raising prices to reflect market demand, had little incentive to scale private enterprises or innovate production. The empire consistently sacrificed long-term economic dynamism for short-term social stability. Underneath the grand logistics and pristine administrative ledgers lay a heavy human cost. The entire imperial budget was extracted from millions of agricultural peasants working at the base of the economy. Whether Muslim or Christian, the peasantry shouldered the vast majority of the tax burden. Farmers paid a direct tithe on their crops, seasonal emergency taxes that gradually became permanent annual levies, and, for non-Muslims, the jizya, a head tax paid in exchange for state protection and military exemption. When campaigns were successful and plunder flowed back to the core, the system remained stable. But when wars became protracted, expensive, and non-lucrative, the state resorted to tax farming. The government auctioned off the rights to collect provincial taxes to wealthy urban investors in exchange for immediate cash up front. These tax farmers then used private guards to extract every available grain of wheat from rural villages to maximize their return on investment. Desperate, impoverished peasants systematically abandoned their fields. Thousands fled into inaccessible mountain ranges or joined armed bandit networks, tearing at the agricultural fabric of the empire. The cost of military expansion was not only paid in casualties at the front line, but in abandoned villages and depleted rural economies across the interior. In the late 16th century, this fragile economic equilibrium hit a sudden, devastating shock that originated half a world away. It came from the Americas. As Spanish conquistadors conquered the Americas and extracted hundreds of tons of high-purity silver from the silver mountain of Potosí and the mines of Zacatecas, cheap silver flooded global trade networks. This sparked the price revolution, a massive wave of global hyperinflation. Silver poured across the Mediterranean, causing its market value to drop sharply. For an Ottoman financial system centered entirely around a fixed weight of silver in the akçe, the shock was catastrophic. Between 1580 and 1600, domestic prices across the Ottoman Empire soared by more than 100%. Grain, meat, and basic military equipment became prohibitively expensive overnight. Faced with a massive budget shortfall and unable to pay its troops, the imperial treasury chose a destructive shortcut: currency debasement. The mint recalled silver coins, melted them down, diluted them with cheap copper, and reissued them at the exact same nominal face value. In 1589, the government cut the actual silver content of the akçe nearly in half in a single debasement. The political reaction was immediate. When the janissaries received their quarterly payroll in lightweight, diluted silver coins, they recognized the deception instantly. Armed regiments abandoned their barracks and marched on Topkapi Palace, surrounding the imperial residence and demanding the execution of the Sultan's chief financial officers. To save his own life, the Sultan was forced to hand his top ministers over to the mob on the palace lawn. Simultaneously, the debasement gutted the Timar system. The fixed tax revenues assigned to local sipahis could no longer buy basic armor, horses, or supplies in an inflated market. The traditional cavalry force rapidly dissolved. To fill the military void, the state was forced to expand the ranks of paid, musket-wielding janissaries. But more standing infantry meant higher cash payrolls, forcing further debasements and triggering an endless loop of inflation, fiscal deficit, and military mutiny. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse overnight. It was resilient, highly adaptable, and survived for another 3 centuries. But the structural fiscal crisis of the late 16th century permanently fundamentally altered its trajectory. Unable to rely on continuous territorial conquest to fund its budget, the empire pivoted from a military expansion engine into a heavily bureaucratized fiscal state reliant on domestic tax auctions, regional elites, and commercial monopolies. The core takeaway of the Ottoman expansion model remains remarkably clear. You cannot rely on short-term territorial expansion to cover long-term structural operating costs. When your financial machinery requires constant external growth just to meet yesterday's financial obligations, the moment your expansion stops, your internal economy begins to consume itself. The Ottoman Empire during the Age of Expansion was not sustained by sheer military force. It was a massive, highly complex, and deeply fragile financial machine that successfully transformed wheat, tax ledgers, and silver coins into world dominance, until the hidden math of its own overhead caught up with it.